The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Red Canyon, casting long shadows from the wooden storefronts and hitching posts. The year was 1887, and this small frontier town had seen better days. What used to be a thriving community of honest ranchers and merchants had slowly withered under the iron grip of fear. That fear had a name: Black Iron Sullivan and his gang of 10 ruthless outlaws who had claimed the territory as their own hunting ground. Daniel Harper stood at the edge of his family's modest ranch, his green eyes scanning the horizon where dust clouds announced the approach of unwelcome visitors. At 19, he appeared unremarkable. Lean frame draped in a simple beige cotton shirt and worn leather pants, his brown hair tousled by the constant desert wind. The weathered Colt .45 at his hip had been his father's, passed down after consumption claimed the older Harper 6 months prior. To anyone watching, Daniel looked like just another young farmer, barely old enough to shave, certainly not someone who could stand against the terror that plagued Red Canyon. The thundering of hooves grew louder, and Daniel's jaw tightened as he recognized the silhouettes approaching. Sullivan's gang rode like a plague of locusts, their dark clothing and menacing presence preceding them like a shadow. At their head rode Black Iron himself, a massive man whose scarred face told stories of countless violent encounters. The jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw caught the sunlight like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. "Well, well, boy," Sullivan's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to fear and obedience. His black leather coat gleamed despite the dust, and the twin Colt .44s with ivory handles rested easy in their holsters. "Heard your daddy passed. Shame that." He was reasonable, paid his protection fees without fuss. Daniel remained silent, his hands steady at his sides. The other 9 riders formed a semicircle around him, their faces bearing the cruel satisfaction of predators cornering prey. Each man was a veteran of frontier violence, scarred, weathered, and utterly confident in their superiority of numbers. "See, boy," Sullivan continued, dismounting with practiced ease. "This land's got potential. Good water source, decent grazing. My associates and we've decided it'd serve us better than some snot-nosed kid playing at being a rancher." The gang leader's eyes were cold as winter steel, devoid of any human warmth. "So here's how this works. You sign over the deed, take whatever trinkets you can carry and ride out. Do that, and you get to keep breathing." The wind whistled through the canyon walls, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Daniel's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the desert air like a gunshot. "No." Sullivan's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. "No? Did I hear that right, boys?" The laughter that erupted from the gang was harsh and mocking. "This here's Daniel Harper, all grown up and thinking he's a man." He stepped closer, his massive frame casting Daniel in shadow. "Let me paint you a picture, boy. 10 experienced guns against 1 farm kid who probably can't hit the side of a barn. You really want to play those odds?" Daniel's green eyes met Sullivan's without flinching. "I said no. This land belonged to my father, and his father before him. You want it, you'll have to take it." The gang's laughter died as they recognized something unexpected in the young man's tone, not bravado or foolish courage, but a quiet certainty that unsettled them. Sullivan's hand drifted toward his gun, but something in Daniel's posture gave him pause. "Tell you what, boy," Sullivan said after a moment. "You got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit don't stop bullets. I'm going to give you 24 hours to think it over. Tomorrow at high noon you meet us in town. You can either sign those papers." He paused, his scarred face splitting into a genuine grin, "or we'll have ourselves some entertainment." As the gang wheeled their horses and rode back toward town, kicking up clouds of red dust, Daniel remained motionless. Only when the sound of hooves faded completely did he allow himself to exhale. His hand unconsciously moved to the worn grip of his Colt, and for just a moment his fingers betrayed the slightest tremor, not of fear, but of memory. 3 years ago, everything had changed. Daniel had been 16, struggling to help his ailing father maintain their ranch, when he encountered the hermit who lived in the caves high up in the canyon walls. Most folks thought Elijah Torres was just a crazy old man, but Daniel had seen something different in those piercing blue eyes. What started as bringing food to a lonely old-timer had evolved into something extraordinary. "Speed ain't everything, boy." The old man's voice echoed in Daniel's memory. Elijah had been a legend once. Old Wolf Torres, a gunfighter whose name was spoken in whispers across 3 states. But that was before he disappeared into the wilderness, seeking peace from a violent past. Accuracy, timing, and knowing when to move. That's what keeps a man alive. Any fool can draw fast. Takes wisdom to draw at the right moment. For 3 years, Daniel had climbed to those caves every spare moment, learning not just to shoot, but to think like a gunfighter. Elijah had taught him to read his opponents, to control his breathing, to find that perfect moment between heartbeats when the world stood still. The old hermit had seen something in Daniel that the young man himself hadn't recognized. A natural calm under pressure, reflexes that could be honed to perfection, and most importantly, the moral clarity to know when violence was justified. As Daniel walked back toward his modest ranch house, the weight of tomorrow's confrontation settled on his shoulders. He knew what he had to do, but the prospect of facing 10 armed men still churned his stomach. This wasn't some practice session in the canyon. These were killers who wouldn't hesitate to gun him down like a dog. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Daniel tried to maintain his normal routine. He fed the cattle, mended a section of fence, and cleaned his father's old revolver with methodical precision. But his mind kept drifting to Sarah Collins, the blonde daughter of the general store owner who had always been kind to him. She was one of the few people in town who didn't treat him like a child, and the thought of never seeing her again made his chest tight. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Daniel made a decision that would have surprised everyone who thought they knew him. Instead of spending his possibly final evening in solitude, he saddled his horse and rode into Red Canyon. The town was unusually quiet, even for early evening. News of the confrontation had spread, and most sensible folks were keeping their heads down. Daniel tied his horse outside Collins' general store and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. Through the window he could see Sarah organizing inventory, her golden hair catching the lamplight. She looked up as he entered, and her blue eyes immediately filled with concern. "Daniel," she said softly, setting down a bolt of fabric. "I heard what happened. Folks are saying—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "They're saying I'm a dead man," Daniel completed with a wry smile. "Can't argue with their logic." He approached the counter, acutely aware of how normal everything seemed. The smell of coffee and leather goods, the tick of the wall clock, the way Sarah's worried expression made her even more beautiful. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said urgently. "There's no shame in leaving. You could start over somewhere else, somewhere safe." Daniel shook his head. "If I run, Sullivan will just find another target. Someone else's family. Someone else's land. It has to stop somewhere." He reached across the counter and gently took her hand. "But I wanted you to know, if things don't go well tomorrow, you've been the brightest thing in this town for me." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You talk like you're already dead. Maybe you know something the rest of us don't. Maybe you're not the helpless farm boy everyone thinks you are." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "We'll find out tomorrow." As he prepared to leave, Sarah called out softly, "Daniel?" He turned back. "Whatever happens, know that I believe in you. I always have." The walk from the store to the saloon took only minutes, but it felt like crossing into another world. The Dusty Rose Saloon was Red Canyon's heart of corruption, where Sheriff Marcus Kane held court with Sullivan's gang and anyone else willing to profit from the town's misery. Daniel pushed through the bat-wing doors and conversation died like a snuffed candle. The saloon reeked of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed men. Sheriff Kane sat at his usual table near the back, his substantial belly straining against his brown vest. His small, calculating eyes widened with surprise and amusement as Daniel approached. Sullivan and his 9 men occupied the bar, their dark clothing making them look like carrion birds perched for feeding. "Well, I'll be damned," Kane chuckled, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. "Look what the cat dragged in, boys. The Harper boy come to tell us he's changed his mind, I reckon." Daniel stopped in the center of the room, every eye upon him. The floorboards creaked under his boots, and somewhere in the background, the saloon's piano sat silent as a tomb. "I'm here to make something clear," he said, his voice steady and carrying. Tomorrow at noon, I'll be waiting in the street. Any of Sullivan's men who want to try their luck against me, they're welcome to it." The silence stretched for a heartbeat before erupting in laughter. Kane's wheezing chuckles mixed with the gang's harsh guffaws, creating a symphony of mockery. Sullivan himself turned from the bar, his scarred face showing genuine amusement. "Boy, I got to hand it to you," Sullivan said, raising his whiskey glass in a mock salute. "You got more balls than brains. But let me make sure I understand. You're saying you'll face all 10 of my men alone?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Daniel replied without hesitation. The laughter reached a crescendo. Kane slapped his knee, tears streaming down his florid cheeks. 10 men. The boy thinks he's some kind of gunfighter from a dime novel. Kid, these ain't farmers or store clerks. These are killers. Professional killers. You'll be dead before you clear leather." Daniel's eyes swept the room, taking in every face, memorizing every detail. He had learned from Elijah that knowing your enemies was as important as knowing yourself. The man at the bar's left end favored his right hand but had a slight tremor, probably an old wound. The one next to him kept touching his gun nervously. Fast, but sloppy. Each had tells, weaknesses, patterns that could be exploited. "Maybe," Daniel said calmly. "But tomorrow at noon, we'll all find out what I'm made of." He turned and walked toward the door, ignoring the continued laughter and crude comments behind him. Just before reaching the entrance, he paused and looked back. "Oh, and Sheriff Kane? You might want to think about whose side you're really on. Come tomorrow, this town's going to remember who stood where." The laughter faltered slightly at the quiet confidence in his tone, but resumed as Daniel pushed through the doors. Outside, the desert evening was cool and star-bright, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the saloon. Daniel untied his horse and rode home slowly, using the time to center himself as Elijah had taught him. That night, Daniel barely slept. He sat on his porch watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the distant howl of coyotes. In his mind, he rehearsed everything Elijah had taught him, not just the mechanics of drawing and firing, but the mental preparation that separated survivors from corpses. "Fear's natural, boy," Elijah's voice whispered in his memory. "Any man who ain't scared in a gunfight is either lying or stupid. The trick is to use that fear, let it sharpen your focus instead of clouding it. When the moment comes, trust your training and let instinct take over." As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Daniel rose and prepared for what might be his final day. He washed carefully, shaved with his father's old razor, and dressed in his best clothes. Not fancy, but clean and respectable. He cleaned his Colt one final time, checking the cylinder in action with the thoroughness Elijah had drilled into him. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Daniel tried to eat but had no appetite. He walked through his small ranch, touching familiar objects as if memorizing them. The wooden chair his father had carved, the fence posts they had set together, the grave marker he had erected after the funeral. All of it might pass to other hands before sunset. As the sun reached its zenith, Daniel saddled his horse and rode into town one last time. The streets were eerily empty, but he could sense watchers behind curtains and shutters. Word had spread beyond Red Canyon, and folks had come from neighboring settlements to witness what would either be a miraculous victory or a spectacular slaughter. Daniel dismounted in front of the general store and tied his horse to the hitching post. Sarah emerged from the doorway, her face pale but determined. Without a word, she approached him and pinned something to his shirt. A small silver star that had belonged to her grandfather. "For luck," she whispered, then stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Come back to me, Daniel Harper." The church bell chimed 12 times, each note hanging in the desert air like a death knell. Daniel walked to the center of Main Street, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. The sun was directly overhead, eliminating shadows and creating a harsh, revealing light that made everything seem surreal. At the far end of the street, Sullivan's gang emerged from the saloon like a pack of wolves. They spread out across the width of the road, 10 abreast, their faces showing the confidence of men who had never lost such an encounter. Sullivan took the center position, his twin Colts gleaming at his sides while his men flanked him in practiced formation. Sheriff Kane appeared on the saloon's porch, his cowardly excitement evident in his flushed face. "Well, well," he called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. Looks like the Harper boy actually showed up. Got to admire his stupidity, if nothing else. Daniel stood alone in the middle of the street, a solitary figure facing impossible odds. The wind had died completely, leaving the air still and oppressive. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell finished chiming noon, and the sound faded into absolute silence. "Last chance, boy," Sullivan called out, his voice carrying easily across the 50 yards separating them. "Ain't no shame in admitting when you're outgunned. Sign over that deed, and we'll let you ride out of here breathing." Daniel's response was to adjust his stance slightly, feet shoulder-width apart, right hand hanging loose near his gun. The movement was subtle but spoke volumes to anyone who understood the language of violence. This was not a man preparing to surrender. "So be it," Sullivan growled. "Boys, on my count. 3, 2. Time seemed to crystallize around Daniel. Everything Elijah had taught him condensed into this single moment, the countless hours of practice, the wisdom shared in those lonely canyon caves, the understanding that sometimes a man had to stand alone against overwhelming darkness. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied, and the world around him took on a crystalline clarity. 1. 10 hands dropped toward 10 guns in perfect synchronization, but Daniel was already moving, his body responding to instincts honed by 3 years of relentless training. His Colt cleared leather in a fluid motion that seemed to defy time itself, the worn grip fitting his hand like an extension of his will. The first shot echoed across Red Canyon like thunder, followed immediately by 9 more in rapid succession. Dust and smoke filled the air, obscuring the street in a gray haze that drifted slowly in the still air. When it cleared, 10 men lay sprawled in the dust, their guns unfired, their eyes staring sightlessly at the Arizona sky. Daniel stood alone in the middle of the street, smoke curling from the barrel of his father's old Colt. His hands were steady, his breathing even, but his heart hammered against his ribs as the magnitude of what had just occurred sank in. He had faced 10 experienced gunfighters and emerged victorious, but the cost was written in the bodies scattered before him. Sheriff Kane's face had gone white as bleached bone. His small eyes darted between Daniel and the carnage in the street, his corrupt little world crumbling around him. "Impossible," he whispered, then louder, "Impossible. No one's that fast. No one." Daniel slowly holstered his weapon and turned toward the saloon. Every window, every doorway now revealed faces. Townspeople who had hidden in fear for months, emerging like prairie dogs after a storm. Their expressions showed a mixture of awe, disbelief, and dawning hope. "Sheriff Kane," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He gestured toward the legal papers in Kane's trembling hands. "The deed to my family's land. I'll be taking it back now." Kane's hand shook as he fumbled with the documents. You can't, this ain't legal. These men they were killers and thieves," Daniel said calmly. "And you were their accomplice. Now, I can have this conversation with you, or I can have it with whoever replaces you as sheriff. Your choice." Kane practically threw the papers at Daniel, his face slick with sweat despite the desert heat. The deed fluttered in the breeze before Daniel caught it, the legal proof of his family's rightful claim restored to his hands. Sarah was the first to approach, her blue eyes wide with amazement and relief. She looked at the bodies in the street, then back at Daniel, seeing him as if for the first time. "How?" she whispered. "How is this possible?" Daniel managed a tired smile. "I had a good teacher. And sometimes when a man's fighting for what's right, he finds strength he didn't know he had." He looked around at the gathering crowd, seeing hope replacing fear in their faces for the first time in months. Red Canyon's free now. It's up to all of us to keep it that way. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the now peaceful street, Daniel Harper had become something he never expected to be. A legend. But more importantly, he had proven that courage, preparation, and moral conviction could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The farmer's boy who had declared he would face 10 men alone had done exactly that, and in the process, had given his community back its freedom and its future. The bodies were removed, the street was cleaned, and life in Red Canyon began to return to normal. But the story of Daniel Harper's impossible victory would be told and retold for generations, inspiring others to stand up against injustice and proving that heroes could emerge from the most unexpected places. Sarah Collins took Daniel's arm as they walked away from the scene of his triumph. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Daniel looked back at his father's grave marker visible in the distance, then at the town that was finally free from fear. "Now we live," he said simply. "We live free, and we make sure no one like Sullivan ever threatens this place again." And in the growing dusk of that extraordinary day in Red Canyon, Arizona, the legend of the farmer's boy who faced 10 men alone was born, destined to echo through the annals of the American West as proof that sometimes, against all odds, good could triumph over evil through courage, skill, and an unbreakable will to protect what mattered most. 3 weeks had passed since the dust settled on Main Street, and Red Canyon had transformed into something Daniel barely recognized. Where once fearful whispers had filled the air, now children played openly in the streets while their parents conducted business without constantly looking over their shoulders. The town had found its heartbeat again, but with that renewal came unexpected complications that Daniel hadn't anticipated. The Harper Ranch, once a modest homestead on the outskirts of town, had become an unlikely pilgrimage site. Every day brought new visitors, some genuinely curious about the young man who had achieved the impossible, others seeking to test their own skills against the legendary gunfighter of Red Canyon. Daniel found himself in the strange position of being both celebrated and challenged, honored and hunted. On this particular morning, as the sun painted the desert landscape in shades of amber and gold, Daniel sat on his porch, repairing a broken bridle, when the sound of approaching horses caught his attention. Unlike the usual single riders or small groups that had been coming by, this was a substantial party, 8 men in travel-worn clothes, their faces bearing the hard lines of professional violence. The leader dismounted near Daniel's fence, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings. His clothes were expensive but practical, and the way he carried himself spoke of military training and natural authority. When he spoke, his voice carried a refined Eastern accent that seemed out of place in the Arizona desert. "Mr. Harper," the stranger said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "My name is Colonel Thaddeus Blackwood, formerly of the Union Army, currently representing certain business interests in Chicago. I've come a considerable distance to make your acquaintance." Daniel set down his leather work and studied the newcomers carefully. These weren't the usual glory seekers or local troublemakers. These men had the disciplined bearing of soldiers, their weapons maintained with military precision, their horses showing signs of long travel but excellent care. Whatever Blackwood wanted, it was serious enough to bring him across half the continent. "Colonel," Daniel acknowledged with a nod, "that's quite a journey just to meet a farmer. What can I do for you?" Blackwood's smile was polite, but didn't reach his eyes. Modest as well as skilled. "I appreciate that in a man." He gestured toward his companions, who had formed a loose semicircle but kept their hands well away from their weapons. "The truth is, Mr. Harper, your recent demonstration has attracted attention in certain circles. Circles with substantial resources and complex problems that require discrete solutions." Daniel felt a chill despite the desert heat. "I'm not for hire, Colonel. What happened here was personal." Of course," Blackwood said smoothly. "I wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise. But consider this. You've proven yourself capable of extraordinary things under pressure. There are situations arising across this territory, situations where a man of your particular talents could prevent considerable bloodshed and injustice." One of Blackwood's men, a scarred veteran with sergeant's stripes still visible on his faded uniform, stepped forward slightly. "Sir, we've heard stories, but seeing is believing. Perhaps Mr. Harper could demonstrate his skills? Just to satisfy our curiosity." Daniel's hand instinctively moved toward his Colt, but he stopped himself. These men weren't making threats. Yet. But their presence felt like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. "I don't perform tricks for audiences, Sergeant. If you've heard the stories, you know what I'm capable of." Blackwood raised a hand, signaling his men to remain calm. "Forgive Sergeant Murphy. We've been on the trail for 2 weeks, and tensions run high when men are away from civilization for too long." His pale eyes fixed on Daniel with uncomfortable intensity. But he raises a valid point. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, especially out here where entertainment is scarce. Before Daniel could respond, the sound of another horse approaching broke the tension. Sarah Collins rode up the path from town, her blue dress billowing in the morning breeze, her face showing concern as she took in the scene. She had taken to visiting the ranch regularly since the gunfight, bringing news from town and providing a welcome respite from the constant stream of visitors seeking the famous gunfighter. "Daniel," she called out, dismounting gracefully near the porch. "I brought the supplies you asked for." Her eyes swept over Blackwood and his men, noting their military bearing and the way they positioned themselves with tactical awareness. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, miss," Blackwood said with exaggerated courtesy. "Colonel Thaddeus Blackwood at your service. I was just discussing a business proposition with Mr. Harper." Sarah moved to stand beside Daniel, her presence both comforting and concerning. Daniel didn't want her involved in whatever game Blackwood was playing, but he also recognized that her arrival might have prevented an escalation he wasn't prepared for. "What kind of business?" Sarah asked directly, her voice carrying the practical skepticism of someone who had grown up in a frontier trading post. Blackwood's smile became more genuine. "The kind that could make Mr. Harper a wealthy man, miss. There are cattle barons in Montana dealing with rustlers, railroad companies facing organized resistance, mining operations threatened by claim jumpers. Men with Mr. Harper's reputation could write their own price for such services." Daniel felt sick. The idea of becoming a hired gun, selling his skills to the highest bidder, went against everything Elijah had taught him about using violence only when absolutely necessary. "I told you, Colonel. I'm not interested." "Perhaps you should reconsider," Murphy said, his hand moving slightly closer to his weapon. "A man in your position? Well, let's say refusing the wrong people can have consequences." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Daniel's body tensed, his training automatically assessing distances, angles, and the positioning of potential threats. Sarah stepped slightly behind him, recognizing the change in his posture and the sudden stillness that preceded violence. "Sergeant Murphy," Blackwood said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of command. "You forget yourself. We're guests here." But his pale eyes remained fixed on Daniel, studying his reaction with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Daniel's voice, when he spoke, carried the same quiet certainty that had preceded his confrontation with Sullivan's gang. "Colonel, I think this conversation is over. You and your men need to leave my property." For a moment, the desert morning held its breath. The 8 visitors remained motionless, their hands near their weapons, their eyes fixed on Daniel. Then Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of humor but acknowledging Daniel's position. "Of course, Mr. Harper. We wouldn't want to overstay our welcome." He remounted his horse with fluid grace, his men following suit with military precision. "But understand this. Word of your talents has spread far beyond Red Canyon. Whether you seek such attention or not, it will find you. When it does, remember that Colonel Blackwood offered you a choice." As the 8 riders departed, kicking up clouds of dust that drifted slowly in the still air, Sarah moved closer to Daniel. "Who were they really?" she asked quietly. Daniel watched until the riders disappeared around a bend in the canyon road. "Trouble," he said simply. "The kind of trouble that follows a man once he gets a reputation for being fast with a gun." That evening, as Daniel sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant reds and purples, he found himself thinking about Elijah's warnings. The old gunfighter had spoken often about the burden of reputation, how a man known for violence could never truly escape that legacy. "Every man you face will be trying to prove something," Elijah had said during one of their training sessions. "Some want to be known as the man who killed Daniel Harper. Others will want to hire you, use your skills for their own purposes. Either way, your gun becomes your identity, and you become a prisoner of your own legend." The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch interrupted his brooding. Sarah emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, her presence a welcome anchor to normalcy in an increasingly complicated world. "You're thinking about leaving," she said, settling into the chair beside him. It wasn't a question. Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to organize his thoughts. "Maybe I should. Every day brings new problems. Men wanting to test themselves against me, others wanting to hire my gun, and now people like Blackwood making threats. He gestured toward the peaceful valley below. Red Canyon deserves better than being known as the home of a gunfighter. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Remember what you told me that night before the confrontation? You said if you ran, Sullivan would just find another target. That it had to stop somewhere. This is different, Daniel protested. Sullivan was threatening our home, our people. These others, they're my problem, my burden to carry. Are they? Sarah turned to face him fully, her blue eyes reflecting the growing starlight. Daniel, what you did here wasn't just about protecting your land. You showed this entire territory that bullies and criminals can be stopped. You gave people hope. If you run now, what message does that send? Before Daniel could respond, the sound of rapid hoofbeats echoed from the direction of town. A single rider approached at dangerous speed, and Daniel recognized young Tommy Morrison, son of the local blacksmith. The boy's horse was lathered with sweat and his face showed panic as he reined up near the porch. "Mr. Harper," Tommy gasped, fighting to catch his breath. "You got to come quick. There's trouble in town, bad trouble." Daniel was on his feet immediately. "What kind of trouble, Tommy?" "Men came into the saloon about an hour ago," the boy panted. "Rough-looking men claiming to be bounty hunters. They're saying there's paper out on you. Wanted dead or alive for the murder of 10 men in the street. Sheriff Kane's backing their play, saying you're a dangerous criminal who needs to be brought to justice." Sarah stood up so quickly her chair rocked backward. "That's insane. Everyone saw what happened. It was self-defense." Tommy nodded frantically. "Yes, ma'am, but these bounty hunters, they got papers that look official. And Sheriff Kane, he's telling everyone that harboring a wanted criminal is a federal crime. Folks are scared, Mr. Harper. Real scared." Daniel felt the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. Blackwood's visit hadn't been a recruitment attempt. It had been reconnaissance. The colonel had studied Daniel's character, identified his weaknesses, and then activated a plan designed to force his hand. By turning him into a wanted fugitive, Blackwood could either drive Daniel into hiding or force him to accept the colonel's protection and employment. "How many men?" Daniel asked, already moving toward the house to gather his gear. "6 of them, sir. All armed. All looking like they mean business. They've got the whole saloon convinced you're some kind of outlaw who needs killing." Sarah grabbed Daniel's arm. "You can't go into town. It's obviously a trap." Daniel gently removed her hand, his mind already working through the tactical situation. "If I don't go, they'll come here. And if I run, they'll make life hell for everyone who ever helped me." He looked into her eyes, seeing his own determination reflected back at him. "This ends tonight one way or another." "Then I'm coming with you," Sarah said firmly. "Absolutely not." Daniel's voice carried finality. "Sarah, these aren't Sullivan's local thugs. These are professionals, and they're playing a game with rules I don't fully understand yet." "Then maybe it's time you learned those rules," she replied with unexpected steel in her voice. "Daniel, you can't keep facing every threat alone. This town believes in you, but belief isn't enough against organized criminals with federal backing." As Daniel strapped on his gun belt and checked his Colt, his mind raced through possibilities. 6 professional bounty hunters, backed by corrupt federal authority, operating in a town where his own neighbors might be too frightened to support him. The odds were worse than they had been against Sullivan's gang, because this time his enemies had legal cover for their actions. But as he stepped off his porch and mounted his horse, Daniel realized something that gave him hope. 3 weeks ago, he had been alone against impossible odds. Tonight, he could see lights beginning to appear in windows throughout Red Canyon, not the fearful hiding of intimidated townspeople, but the purposeful illumination of citizens preparing to make a stand. The ride into town took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Daniel's mind kept returning to Elijah's teachings about reading situations and understanding the true nature of conflict. This wasn't just about stopping 6 bounty hunters. This was about breaking a larger pattern of corruption and intimidation that threatened to drag Red Canyon back into the darkness it had just escaped. As he approached the outskirts of town, Daniel could see that his instincts had been correct. Rather than cowering behind locked doors, the people of Red Canyon were positioning themselves strategically. Tom Collins stood on his store's porch with a shotgun. The blacksmith had emerged from his forge with a heavy hammer. Even old Doc Peterson had appeared with an ancient rifle that probably hadn't been fired since the war between the states. The confrontation that awaited him in town would test not just his skills with a gun, but his ability to unite a community against a threat that came wrapped in legal authority. And as Daniel Harper rode toward his destiny for the second time in 3 weeks, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes a man's greatest victory wasn't achieved through superior firepower, but through inspiring others to stand up for what was right. The bounty hunters had chosen the wrong town to intimidate, and they were about to discover that legends weren't born from individual heroics alone, but from the courage of ordinary people willing to stand together against injustice.